Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the 27th Annual National Security Law Conference here at Duke Law School. I am super excited about our next presentation because there were like 1,000 reasons this shouldn't happen, but it did, and everybody's here. I'm glad the young Jags here are not on an airplane, at least right at this moment. They're not on an airplane, maybe tomorrow or whatever, but they're from the 82nd Airborne. Major Walkup, and you have her bio on the agenda, and Captain Boyd. I almost gave you a promotion there, field promotion. I'm a general. I think I can do that, can't I? But without further ado, how about if we just start? But let me just start by, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Major Walkup, and how you wound up in the Army and what you enjoy about it.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. And I appreciate first the opportunity to be here. As you may know, Colonel Thurner is the SJ of the 82nd and was originally supposed to be here, but is doing great things for America right now. So my background, and actually Captain Boyd's, we're about 10, 11 years apart. I've been in the Army for about 11 years, but we have the same schooling background, completely coincidental and very rare in our organization. So both went to UC San Diego for undergrad. No military affiliation, and then both went to Georgetown for law school. Again, no military affiliation at that time. I think we both felt a calling for maybe slightly different reasons, but found ourselves in the JAG Corps and have been.
What was your calling?
So my undergrad background is in quantitative economics, and I started actually working as an analyst for a famous economist, Art Laffer. You're probably too young to know who he is. And started working on analyzing policy, tax policy specifically. And I was really drawn towards the significance of impacting something like policy. That's why, I went to DC with the idea of being able to enter the policy realm, make an impact in a broader context. I started doing some work in that realm, was a little disenfranchised, to be honest, and my background growing up is actually, I grew up overseas in Indonesia and moved around a lot. My brother at the time was doing a college visit to the Naval Academy, and I took him up there to hear their spiel, and I'm from Northern California, Palo Alto, the female, this option of a military academy hadn't really ever been presented to me, and I heard the spiel and was like, oh my gosh, I can jump out of airplanes and practice all different sorts of law. I don't have to specialize in one area. I can move around the world. It just seemed to be a perfect fit for me. So here I am, just a couple.
Captain Boyd?
Very different. I had nothing to do with tax policy. I was political science in undergrad, so a very cliche lawyer path. But I grew up in Southern California in a town that used to be a Marine naval base, obviously very close to Camp Pendleton. San Diego is a big Navy town, so that's always been a background influence. I'd wanted to be an attorney for my entire life, and my high school water polo coach was a former Navy SEAL, and he was the first one to suggest that I consider the JAG Corps. I ended up in undergrad stumbling into a Coast Guard JAG internship, which is how I know the executive officer from your the last presentation, Captain Spivak, who's been a friend and mentor since I was an undergrad and did that internship. But from my very first experience with JAG, I was taken aback and just blown away by the fantastic people who I got to work with and the interesting things that they do and just the sense of community. And it seemed like it was the very best of the legal world and the military world and sort of the best of humanity all put together. So I did some more internships in law school with the Navy Marines at their Court of Criminal Appeals, and then an Army internship. And similarly, once I found out I could jump out of airplanes, I was pretty sold on Army and got lucky enough to end up at the 82nd.
Yeah, Captain Spivak, I think they're still stung by the idea that you're not wearing a Coast Guard uniform right now. But well, why don't we get on with your presentation, and because it's very unique, we are super lucky to have them, and let me get out of the way.
All right, thank you.
You don't hear a general say that too often.
All right, so we are here to kind of bring down the level of conversation. So you've heard from preeminent experts in their field about very interesting emergent legal topics. And our purpose here today is to kind of give you the operational context and tactical context and what it looks like to be a real practitioner who is aligned with the military units that are actually conducting these operations and the role we play. Questions are really welcome at any time, so please, interrupt me. Otherwise, at the end, we're happy to take any questions. I will kind of caveat at the beginning, we're going to go into some recent operations. Primarily, we'll focus on the evacuation from Afghanistan, which we were both a part of. There will be constraints to some of the information that we can share, but please, ask what you would like to. All right, so I think kind of for broad context, the Army I came into in 2011 was very focused on two large conflicts that we were involved in, right? Obviously, Afghanistan and Iraq. I spent time early in my career in Afghanistan at the height of the complexity of that engagement. In the last couple of years, we have reduced our footprints in those large engagements and shifted what our focus is, right? And that shift, coming away from those conflicts, is really to increase our ability to respond to all threats worldwide. And there's nowhere more that's felt than at the 82nd Airborne Division, who is the core element of the immediate response force of the country. And as a legal practitioner, that comes that creates a tremendous change in how we prepare, the advice that we give, and what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. So just kind of get started and give some background on what the IRF is. And I know there's a variance in probably understanding about the military and organizations and stuff. So if there's anything I say that doesn't make sense, please ask for clarification. So the immediate response force was created in 2019. It was kind of adapted from a pre-existing, what we called the Global Response Force. And it is an element, primarily a brigade-sized element, that is on call at all times to respond to any crisis in the world, at any place that the country needs us to be. The model is a scalable and tailorable model. So there are Air Force elements and other units that have unique capabilities that can be augmented with the core of that infantry brigade to create special capabilities to meet whatever the demand of the challenge is. The way we manage that internally is that there are, there's 3 infantry brigades in a division, and we rotate who is on call. So the standard is that there's always going to be an element that can deploy anywhere in the world for any mission within 18 hours. And through those 3 brigades, we trade off, who is kind of on the hook to go immediately. The depth all can eventually join. The breadth of missions that we could potentially support include traditional armed conflict, humanitarian assistance, evacuations, NEOs, and really any situation that you could think of that would require the military's assistance. The 82nd Airborne Division is the country's only airborne division, and that's significant. It's significant in that we bring some unique capabilities to the fight. We have special expertise in airborne operations, airborne insertions, and really essentially we travel very lightly, right? So because we are prepared to jump out of airplanes with all of our equipment, we are also lighter to pack up and put on a plane, even if we don't end up jumping out of that airplane. And so that's why we're kind of uniquely positioned to fill that role. So I said in 2019 is when we kind of shifted to this new model, right, as we were transitioning away from Afghanistan and Iraq. There's been 4 official activations of the IRF since its creation. So the first activation was on New Year's Eve of 2019, when Iran started in response to the killing of General Soleimani, increased their aggression towards bases in Iraq. My brigade, were from 1st Brigade Combat Team, I should have mentioned that, was the unit who responded to that activation. Captain Boyd actually at the time was at the division level, right? We're now at the brigade level, assisted in that response. So she was first out the door from the division team. Then the next activation was in May of 2020 to respond, to be positioned to assist in the response to the civil unrest in the nation's capital in the summer of 2020. The element that went forward was from our brigade as well. They were, though, a few days later sent back to Fort Bragg and didn't stay involved in, or get involved in that situation. So then the situation we're going to focus on is the deployment of the IRF in August of 2021 to support the evacuation from Afghanistan. And then most recently, earlier this month, the IRF was activated to support our NATO allies in Europe. And I would note that that's clearly an ongoing operation right now, so I'm sure there's a lot of interest in what's going on, and that's understandable. Well, there's probably limited current operation information I can share on that front. But that's my team there while we're in Kuwait, redeploying. All right, Hayley's going to go over what the legal support looks like to our team.
So there are a ton of lawyers from the 82nd Airborne Division at both the division and the brigade level. Major Walkup and I are both at the brigade level. She is the brigade judge advocate, the primary legal advisor to our brigade commander in all matters ranging from military justice to the operational law that we saw out in Afghanistan. I tend to assist the company grade levels with a focus on military justice, though of course in a dynamic environment, as we'll talk about, that focus shifts a little bit when our brigade mission shifts. At the division level, we have a couple of different sections with a focus mostly to support the brigade and also to provide advice to the 2-star commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division. So the SJA, our staff judge advocate, is the colonel who is in charge of all of the attorneys and paralegals within the division. They have a military justice section where all of our trial counsel sit and work hard to impact justice and bring cases to court-martial. We have an administrative law section that deals with ethics, with investigations, with what? Contracts. Yes, they have a section that's also contract and fiscal law, which deals with a lot of monetary issues with contractors both here and downrange, which can be pretty interesting. And then, of course, legal assistance, which provides support to soldiers through, most relevantly to deployments, powers of attorney so that their spouses can be taken care of while they're deployed, and wills in the event of so that they're taken care of afterwards. That our mission set often changes. Like I said, that focus from garrison to deployed, and we're going to talk about that a little bit down in this presentation.
And kind of just to add to that, so when you're at the brigade level, which for the Army is really the lowest, most tactical level that lawyers are nested at, we are the legal advisors for the entire organization. And so, you know, we provide advice for that whole range of different subject matter areas that we at higher echelons kind of specialize our groups into. And it's just the two of us. So a brigade is about 4,500 or so paratroopers, and the two of us are the two attorneys that provide that entirety of advice to that formation.
Although it would be remiss if we didn't say that we also had a great team of paralegals at the brigade and in each of the sections. And our paralegals also go with us on deployment. One of our NCOs was the first person from the legal shop on the ground in the 2019 activation, was not too far behind you in the Afghanistan one, and got on the bus to go to DC, but actually turned around before he actually made it there. So that one paralegal has been heavily involved, and all of our other paralegals do deploy with the brigade as well to provide critical legal support to all of the commanders.
All right, so let's get to, I guess, a little bit of story time. So I'll bring you back to last summer, right? We, as a nation, had committed to withdrawing our military footprint from Afghanistan, and had begun that withdrawal. During that time, the Taliban started to gain incredible territorial gains, right? And they made fast movement through the country, and faster than many experts would have predicted they did. We had made a commitment as a nation to withdraw certain individuals from that state, as well as our typical obligations towards American citizens. So on the 12th of August, I had tried to take my first week of leave that year. About 2 days into my leave, I was at the Raleigh Farmers Market. I got a call that we were activated, and drove as fast as I could back to Fort Bragg. And 12 hours later was on a bus starting my movement towards Afghanistan. Those 12 hours are an incredibly saturated 12 hours, right? So in that time, we're responsible for ensuring the entire legal apparatus is taken care of. So there's a mission set to transfer our criminal law, our military justice, all of our actions that will remain in the rear to folks staying there so that there's continuity of cases. We are we're readying all of our paralegals to be ready to support the operation. So everyone's packing, drawing equipment, that kind of thing. And at the same time, we are analyzing the mission, figuring out who is going to be there as far as legal practitioners, what type of situation we will be entering, what the needs are, and we're providing advice to our commanders on what to expect and what that response is going to be. And so those first couple hours are critical. Really, our focus is getting out the door, and the reason there's an apparatus around us, a division, is they help with us getting pushed out. So, rules of engagement at that time are very important, and that apparatus is assisting us in ensuring everyone is prepared. But this was a unique situation, right? At this time, the government of Afghanistan was still in control of the country. The State Department is in control of evacuations, and we understood our mission was to help facilitate and fill in gaps in what the State Department needed. But we didn't know what the conditions on the ground were going to be. Those are unknowns that we don't control and that you can't always plan for, right? And this was certainly a situation where we controlled our movement and very little else from a tactical level. So my movement kind of continued from there, and I arrived on HKIA on 15 August. At the time that I arrived, the government of Afghanistan was still in control of the country, but the Taliban was encircling the capital. I linked up, there was two other two Marine Corps judge advocates that were there supporting the evacuation. And my kind of first mission and goal was to sync with them and get on the same page and level all of our bubbles, figure out what our legal issues were, and ensure that we could function as a team. And we did that very well and very quickly. And an hour or two after linking up with them, the capital officially fell to the Taliban, and the embassy was evacuated. During that time, the civilian population obviously had a tremendous response to that Taliban takeover and gathered at the airport that evening. From our perspective, there were a lot of unknowns. There was not a clear understanding of what the Taliban's priorities were going to be, what they were going to allow, or what their preferences would be as far as the operations at the airport. And there was a lot of people that we needed to evacuate. So at that point, my biggest priority is ensuring all those paratroopers who are starting to take control of the security of the airport are empowered to make good decisions, to understand what the rules of engagement are, what the big picture priorities of the United States are, so that every one of those individuals who's faced with a tremendously hard situation, a nuanced situation, is able to make those good decisions. So those first couple days are very chaotic, and I think many of you saw the images on the next day, 16 August, where the civilians continued to come onto the airfield, and we continued to contain that situation and attempt to establish security so that we could start the evacuation process. And I will tell you, and I'll mention this later, kind of reflections, those paratroopers did a fabulous job. It was a confusing situation, trying to distinguish between who is presenting, a hostile threat to you versus, the civilian who's just desperate to leave is a difficult task, and the team did a great job. There were developments on how the Taliban and the United States were going to work forward, right? And there was somewhat of an agreement established, but the dynamics there are still complex given our obvious history. We continue to bring additional forces on during this time, and that's why, a couple of days later, when there were more of a military presence there, we were able to establish that security perimeter a little bit more effectively. The division arrived, so Colonel Thurner was there a few days later on 18 August, and they increased our ability to plan and project that security force. This is also when we were able to start then getting aircraft out and process civilians through the State Department. And for that next week, really were highly successful in filling aircraft and getting individuals out. The bombing near Abbey Gate occurred on 26 August, which had then an obvious impact on our timeline and how we were able to continue processing people. We focused then on what was projected as our kind of deadline to get out of there by the end of the month, and fully withdrew our forces on 30 August, which is when Colonel Thurner and I left. So that is kind of the sequence of events to kind of give you context of what it was like there. It was a dense 2 weeks with a lot of emotion, a lot of complexities to the legal terrain, and just a lot of human suffering and emotion. So I think, actually, why don't you talk about a little bit so Hayley arrived 18th, okay, like 3 or 4 days after I did, but was filling an important role while I was there a little bit earlier. You want to talk kind of your perspective?
Absolutely. So I was a little bit of the stopgap in communication between Fort Bragg and the attorneys, the Marine attorneys who are already there while Major Walkup was on the plane and couldn't be in contact with them. So I was trying to establish communications to get the rules of engagement, the most updated version, to provide her with that info for when she got on the ground and could start briefing paratroopers. We were also working with the paralegals to figure out who was going where and when, and to make sure that we could, as you said, provide continuity in the rear detachment. We still had court-martials going on. We had non-judicial punishment and separations that were going to continue while the rest of the brigade was deployed. So we'd had planned for that as best we could without knowing for sure that would get activated when or what exactly that would look like, and had a plan in place for which paratroopers would be allowed to go forward and which ones would not. And so I was coordinating with the paralegals to talk to their commanders to make sure that those actions could progress when we were gone, so we didn't just have a blank spot in our military justice system. My NCO and IC and I were two of the last ones to remain in the US while everyone else had been pushed forward. So there was a lot of personnel tracking, trying to figure out who was in Afghanistan, who was in Kuwait, which was kind of the staging area for some of the brigade. We were coordinating with division, we were coordinating with our personnel people to get us on flights to move forward. At that time, when all of the paratroopers were waiting to get on flights, is when often the rules of engagement briefs would go. There's a requirement to do those briefs before a deployment, and so that would be when that occurred. Although, of course, in this situation with the legal landscape changing too much, a lot of the briefs were done downrange when we actually knew what was going on. And so that was kind of my role in those 3 or 4 days before I did get on ground after the alert, to fill in some of the communication gaps, to keep the military justice train moving, and then to try to just get the information downrange to the people who needed it right then.
Speaking of ROE briefs, I got to do a kind of a first for me and conduct one on a C-17 with a Sergeant Major on my way over there over the loudspeaker system. So that kind of brings me to the first point of summarizing some of the lessons learned or impacts that this brought to how legal services are provided. And the first is just how dynamic it was at the time. There were so many unknowns. The political landscape was changing. The mission set was changing in response to the situation on the ground. And that is unique from a practitioner on how I have been, how I have dealt with previous situations. So, I previously deployed to Afghanistan in 2015 and 16. I knew ahead of time where I was going. I knew what the rules were. I knew who everybody was. I had a computer and a desk station, a phone that worked. I had rules, rules of engagement and tactical directives that were many pages long and had been, kind of gone through the system. And so it was a very established system that I entered with some unknowns, right? There's always going to be unknowns, but a lot more was in control. This is a totally different situation, and really, I think what we're going to be faced with much more frequently going forward. And while, there's a little bit of irony there because it was going back to Afghanistan where I had been many years earlier, and the oldest theater that we have been involved with, and yet it was as if it was a brand new situation that didn't have the benefit of those established structures and systems and all the knowns that once existed had been wiped away. And so as a practitioner, figuring out how to deal with that change is important, and understanding that as much as you can stay ahead of the issues as they arise, right? So now as issues arise in the world, we're getting as smart as we can in the legal terrains in all of those issues in preparation if something were to happen. But also just being comfortable, being flexible, being comfortable with your organizations, having the trust of your commanders, having a system to disseminate information quickly, right? So in a formation of thousands of paratroopers, you can't always personally communicate with all of them, right? So if, for example, the situation had changed and the rules of how we engage with the Taliban, for example, had changed, how would we disseminate that information down to the lowest level? And that the answer really is, again, those relationships with the leadership, engagement with them, training them to be responsive to changes and to nuance, and training them to not just be focused on an Afghanistan-Iraq fight, but the whole breadth of requirements that the military is asked to fill. Anything else on that one? Okay. So there are a lot of legal issues that come up in a combat environment, just like there are when we're at home. But the one that matters probably the most is advising on the use of force. force, right? Because that is the issue that impacts the individuals the most and impacts strategically the mission the most. And in this situation, it was highly complex, right? So we are, you understand when there is a hostile actor, when you have authorities, what authorities you can apply, right? If it's a certain organization that you're allowed to engage with. The situation on the ground here was that there were so many different types of actors, right? So we had a persistent threat from ISIS, from a terrorist organization that imbued the entire environment. There was a large presence of the Taliban, which exists in kind of a, middle state, unknown state, right? They have claimed proper, they've claimed to be the rightful government in Afghanistan at this point. We have not recognized that as a nation, and their actions in the past have not provided us with a whole lot of confidence that they're going to act in the way they say they act. So they're kind of a free radical. And then there is a massive civilian population that understandably is imbued with all types of panic and unrest given the situation. So training the soldiers to understand that nuance and to empower them to make good decisions and not be paralyzed by the complexity of that environment is in part your job, right? And it's a difficult job, but it is a vital job. And really, the way you impact that the most is not when you get there on August 15th. It's in training throughout the year and injecting all of that nuance into that training, but also being available. So there, as units started taking over security roles, I would go out and check in with them to figure out what issues were arising, what questions they had, hypotheticals, and being available to work through those kind of problem sets with soldiers before they're faced with those difficult decisions. But very complex terrain. And I think it's one that's reasonable to see in the future. So, anything I didn't cover? Okay.
And this was a shorter operation when, and you could speak more to that on more longer deployments when, again, it's more of a steady state operation. Things other than operational law would come up during that time period. In this case, we had approximately 2 weeks in Afghanistan where the focus was 100% operational law. That's not true for most military deployments.
So the kind of the next big area that there was some friction is how to balance everything you need to do. So when we arrived, it was all about the immediate, establishing security, figuring out what was going to happen, what was happening, communicating that to everybody there. At one point, I personally was in a security role when things got really bad, and so I'm balancing normal soldier duties as well. As things start to stabilize, we start planning for the evacuations and then start conducting the operations. But we're still fulfilling a security role. And then at the same time, we're planning for what really was for the military, the most critical part of this operation, which was the very last withdrawal, what we call a joint tactical exfil. And so the operational planning of how we will shrink our footprint and leave and yet keep everybody safe is a complex operation to plan. So you're planning forward, you're dealing with a nuance now, and really you're still dealing with silly stuff, not silly stuff, but routine things that come up at home. So we had a court martial going on, a trial that we had to figure out a witness and get them home. Captain Boyd was doing powers of attorney for people who had emergencies, getting kicked out of their homes. So you're balancing these massive macro problem sets while still making sure that that everything doesn't go to chaos at home. And so that takes, I think, from the legal practitioner, the ability to have bandwidth and a really strong network. And so I talked about when I first got there, my first task was linking in with the Marine Corps JAGs that were there. That network expands beyond there. It expands to the units and kind of outside of the country that are supporting us, and having good relationships with the division that we're still at Fort Bragg, and using the expertise that surrounds you to balance all of that going forward. Any stories you want to inject?
On the lighter note of an example of things that came up, we had two paratroopers get into a fight with each other. Not a serious fight, but a little verbal altercation before they boarded a aircraft to exit Afghanistan. And of course, we had an investigation into it and then an Article 15 after the fact. So even in the midst of these kinds of rules of engagement, where we're determining who's a potential terrorist threat and who's a civilian who's just trying to get out of the country safely, we also had paratroopers trying to knock each other's teeth out and needing to be told that that's not appropriate in that environment.
Absolutely. And I guess I would add to this the breadth of the legal support that we're providing there extended to things that maybe you wouldn't think about. So there are a lot of regulatory, administrative type things, right? So what to do with property, the U.S. military property there, what to do with our property. Can we bring in certain types of donated humanitarian goods? What type of support can we provide to the civilians that are around the airfield? All of that kind of ongoing legal terrain is a continuous requirement to address through an operation like this. And I think, going forward, anything that we'll be involved with. And the last bullet on here is, again, kind of about the relationships. We have not, as a nation, conducted any truly unilateral action for quite some time, and likely won't in the foreseeable future. So the amount of players that existed here on that that airfield, there were numerous, right? So we had State Department and other U.S. agencies that were there who had specific roles in leading the evacuations and coordinating with them on which individuals we were allowed to let through the gates, what the requirements all were there. That was a constant conversation. There were other nations, right? So there were many other nations that were still on the airfield until we were the last to leave, but they were there through that week, a couple-week period, and kind of left through that period. So dealing with them and their requirements and the different obligations they had in their own national rules and what their priorities were, balancing those with what we were doing, which was having primary responsibility for the airfield. And then internally working with all of our different sister services. So the Marine Corps Judge Advocates were there when I arrived. They left a day or two before I did, but we worked together side by side throughout that entire period. There were Air Force Judge Advocates remote that fed in a lot of information and provided guidance throughout the operation as well. And those connections are one that I think will continue to arise and just highlights how important it is to be nested and able to communicate with all of those individuals. Good. All right, so I think those were the main points I wanted to hit. End of the day, I'm incredibly proud with how my team did. It was an intense couple of weeks. I personally learned a lot. And yeah, I think while everyone can have a reasonable opinion about the political decisions that were made, the individual soldiers that showed up on the ground to carry out this evacuation were incredibly professional. They were asked to do just a really difficult job sorting through the situation. and they left with incredible honor and were able to successfully evacuate over 120,000 individuals. And for that, it was an honor to be a part of that operation. So thank you very much for your time. And any questions, I'd be happy to.
If you want to ask a question, just come down to the mic. Let me ask one. Did you have access to comm right away? How was the comm set up?
So the airfield is large, right? And so in some locations there were established communications, really where the headquarters were. Where my brigade was, where we were asked to kind of start supporting, was a different location. So like where the Marine Corps JAGs were, there were good communications there. Where my brigade was, there initially were not. And so we really exercised, again, when I was in Afghanistan before, you have very established computer systems and networks. We were kind of required to use more of our field tactical systems to initially get communications running. So they started out very poor and got to mediocre.
What about, were you billeted in a hard billet, or were you intense, or how'd that work?
Yeah, so I lucked out. Many of my paratroopers did not. We were spread across the entire airfield. Where the headquarters of the brigade was, where I was where the State Department previously resided. So they left the day, as we were arriving, actually, there were still some, like the embassy folks stayed there for longer, but they were in the kind of headquarters location. These other State Department individuals left as we were coming in, handed us over a key. Some of the doors were not unlocked completely. So the State Department digs were very nice, and I have not had the same, previous times in Afghanistan was nowhere nice as that. But most of the soldiers kind of around the airfield were staying in hangars and that kind of thing. So.
How about Chow? Were you MREs or what?
So the paratrooper is a creative individual. It started out as MREs. MREs at a certain point got very light, where there were potentially not going to be enough. And my team found and was able to repurpose a DFAX freezer that had existed before and basically gain access to the old State Department DFAC and start creating good food there. So a few days in, we started having pretty good chow.
How about your equipment? Are there things that you wish you'd brought or wish you'd left home?
Well, our bags never arrived. So, and many people's bags are lost in who knows where. End of the day, I had my rucksack, even though I had, I think, one or two other bags that got on some aircraft at some point. I never saw them. So it taught me a great lesson of never put anything that you're going to need not on your person.
Amen. Amen.
And there were some hard lessons learned by individuals there.
How about you, Captain Boy?
Well, I haven't eaten hard-boiled eggs since Afghanistan, so that's mostly what we got there, even when they broke into the freezers. As for packing lessons, definitely learned how to pack a lot lighter, but also prioritize packing. We get a packing list, the IRF packing list, which is a great guideline, but needs to be updated for the individual situation. And so the PTs in our physical training uniform, which is a little bit lighter than this, for PJs in your rucksack is a great lesson learned that we pass on to every new paratrooper in our office.
I will say on the equipment front, it highlighted the need for judge advocates to be trained on the use of radios and tactical
phones, yeah.
Right, and it's something that through our training we had done some of, but it was heavily needed there, and foreseeable that a future situation we'd have even less good communication.
Yeah, are you capturing the after actions, and we'll develop it through the JAG school and CLAMA will, put out a lessons learned kind of thing?
Yeah, hopefully internally we have, and because, you saw the 3 out of the 4 activations were my brigade, each time I think we got a little bit smarter. So for example, for the initial Iraq activation, we didn't realize that we had to go get all of our actions, legal actions that were all at all the battalions, right? And that created problems down the line. Things got lost and we had to redo them, and there was messiness there. And so, every time we've been doing this, because it's been now pretty routine, we're getting, I think, better and better. But every time there are lessons to be learned, absolutely.
Okay. Oh, this is from Brian Cox at Cornell, former Army JAG, you might know him. What are some challenges you encounter with keeping soldiers at different echelons of command in the BCT, from the brigade talk to the troops on the perimeter, trained on the current use of force / policy on dynamic situation, HKI, evac, and what techniques have you developed to address those challenges?
I mean, that was a major recurring issue, especially as the threat changed. After the bombing, there were a lot more tensions, and working through them with those soldiers, how to respond if they assess a similar situation were to happen. Really two-pronged approach. So one, utilizing the command relationship. So if there's just 1 or 2 of us, and if there's a short period of time, I may not be able to go talk to every single soldier face-to-face to have this discussion. So having, being very integrated with our commanders, knowing them well, training them well, and then transferring, having that, us training them, and then trusting that they are going to be effectively, able to effectively train their soldiers is an important system to have in place. And then you augment that system by as many touch points as you have. So traveling around to the guard towers and touching base with units there. So I'd say I recommend, and what worked best was kind of a two-pronged approach.
Hey, did you have a vehicle? I know some of these questions may sound strange, but when you deploy things like, okay, where am I going to get channel? Where's my vehicle? How am I going to get gas for it? Do I have power?
The just maintaining life systems becomes difficult. Again, creative solutions here. So we did not bring in many vehicles. We brought in mainly personnel. However, this was an airfield that had been quickly abandoned by almost everyone that occupied it. So all the Afghans, the Afghan military prior to the Taliban takeover controlled about half or so of the airfield. Most of them departed. And then, like I said, the State Department, people left. The people left, the equipment did not leave. So we were able to repurpose and find the way to start vehicles that we maybe didn't have the keys for.
Yeah, I like the phrase repurpose. So, and related question that Brian had, this is, what are some challenges you project we'll counter regarding training, use of force, and/or implementing lessons learned from Iraq, Afghanistan, as DoD shifts from coin-centric to full-spectrum strategic competition? That's like, the 18th gap issue.
No, I think that's a great question, and one we discuss a lot internally. I assess the problem to be less at the paratrooper, the soldier level, right? They've only been in from 1 to 4 years. They are pretty easy to remold and don't have the remnants of the last 20 years.
Yeah, what we're talking about is, one of the discussions inside the military is we've gone through, 20 years of counterinsurgency with very complicated and arguably quite restrictive rules of engagement. And now we're trying to prepare for peer level war where you're going to be strictly compliant with the law of armed conflict, but you may not have all those restraints. But some people in the military get a mindset where they confuse what the policy-driven ROE versus what the law may or may not require.
Right, and so the leadership, I think, we have a greater problem set to address those hesitancies with us old folks that have been around for a while. So where the you know, boots on the ground, I think that's an easier problem to fix. But what I saw, but we were able to overcome, is an expectation for that 45-page tactical directive that, you know, delineates every single action that someone can take and every single approval authority and the procedure and nuance. We didn't have that terrain, and I think we need to focus really at the commander and leadership level of being comfortable with that transition. The way we are practicing is that we have exercises, military exercises, and the focus of those exercises has shifted from you know, kind of counterterrorism coin to near peer or peer type of engagements, and I think it's through those iterations with the leadership that we're getting more comfortable with a less defined legal terrain.
Yeah, I think you make a good point that sometimes is lost. The military is pretty quick turnover. So your challenges, you know, I can understand it's with more senior people than with the typical 19-year-old paratrooper, because they don't know anything different. It's whatever you tell them. Any other questions? Oh, okay. Excellent.
This one's not as complicated. It's just
Well, this is really from an extremely important person, Mrs. Dunlap. She's the real commander-in-chief. How did this particular experience change you or impact you, if at all?
Sure, because I think mine's a little less complicated. I hadn't been to Afghanistan before, and so I think my emotions were a little bit less tied into it than some of the other people. Some of the commanders who I'd worked with who'd been in for 18 plus years had said that they'd been to Afghanistan. This was like their 5th or 6th time, and that their experience during this deployment was more intense than all of the other year-long deployments to the same location, same country before. I didn't quite have that experience because I didn't have anything to compare it to. But I think it's very rare as an attorney, whether you're a JAG or in the civilian world, to get to be a part of something that is just good. And this operation, the humanitarian operation, where we successfully got over 120,000 people out of Afghanistan, was just a good thing. There was no, or maybe much less complicated morality to it. You know, we were part of saving lives, just uncomplicated, getting people out in a good way. And I say uncomplicated, even though there was a lot on the ground that was very, very complicated. But the overall morality of it was good. And that was just a win that you don't often get. And so to be a part of that, it's hard to articulate exactly how it has impacted me, but it has. To know that I was part, even a teeny tiny part of a historic operation that's going to change so many people's lives and hopefully give them a bright future in America and in other places is really powerful. And sorry, that's unsatisfying. I don't quite have the words to express.
No, I think that was great. Better than I could frame it. I agree with part of her sentiment. I had spent time there before, so I won't go too, you know, I don't want to delve in too much, but the emotions of the transition and what the country looked like from when we were there and where it was going, or that's something that you have to grapple with on a personal level. This was also unique for me. When I was in Afghanistan before, I worked at the Special Operations Joint Task Force Afghanistan, a 2-star level headquarters. And in that type of environment, you're very removed from the fighting going on the ground. You're a little bit more removed from day-to-day life. There was no removal here. We were, surrounded and engaged with humanity going through the most kind of traumatic transition that they are going to go through in their life. Didn't mention before, but Hayley and I are both female, if you didn't notice, and is there a way to go back slide? Sorry. So that is a unique commodity over there in the military, right? And so we were asked on numerous occasions to, be at the gates and help searching the females because that's a culturally a sensitive touch point. I have the braid picture up there because that symbolizes that the Army actually, I think it was a couple of weeks before this deployment, changed our hair standards, right? And so, the bun was required before, but we're authorized to wear a braid now or a ponytail. And that was significant because it signaled to the females there that we were females, and it made them a lot more comfortable in that process, a little bit less traumatic, hopefully. But for me, my experience was just so much more personal, and I left with an increased respect for the impact that violence and conflict has on the individual, because it was just up close and personal in that way. So I think that's how I was changed.
Well, I just want to say thank you for a terrific presentation. You exceeded my expectations by a lot. I mean, this was really insightful, and I also very much appreciate what you've shared with us, and I think the students do, and hopefully those watching around the world do as well. The Army needs to be very proud of you, and the JAG Corps ought to be very proud of you. Hear, hear. Well, that concludes our first day. We're going to be back here at 0800 tomorrow, and with another big day. And in fact, a couple of the highlights, we're going to have General Phil Breedlove, who was the former NATO commander. We're going to have General Larry Spencer. We're going to have Professor Laurie Blank. We're going to have former General Counsel of the Army, Michelle Pierce, and my friend and brother in another life, Adam Moeller, are going to be talking to us about a bunch of different interesting subjects. I think that our current guests are going to hang around for a little while if people here want to chat with them. And again, really tremendous presentation. I'm going to email General Thurner and your TJ as soon as I get out of here. But really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
appreciate the opportunity. So yes, we will stay around and chat, and then we'll also be at the engagement later.